For this video, we are going to be examining two parts of GDP and trying to figure out how to chart them and how to possibly increase them, and generally speaking, how economists think about them. And that is going to be the personal consumption part of GDP and the investment portion. We're going to look at personal consumption spending first. And to do that, if you think about getting an increase in your disposable income, so this is once you're done with all of the mandatory spending that you have to do on basic necessities, you then have some money left over. That's your disposable income. When you have that disposable income, you have two basic choices of this. Either you're going to spend it or you're going to save it. That's it. Yeah, this is a giant simplification, but we're going to deal with that for now. So if we think of it that way, your disposable income is really equal to your consumption plus your savings. So as you add a single dollar to your disposable income, you have to break it down into how much of that dollar am I spending and how much of that am I saving. And that's going to be the basic difference between the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. So the basic idea here is your marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, is the change in consumer spending divided by the change in disposable income. And we're going to always get that down to a dollar change in disposable income. So for every dollar you get, you're going to spend around 30 cents of that. So your MPC is, 30 cents over a dollar, or 0.3. Your marginal propensity to save is the other side of that coin. It's how much of that dollar you're saving. So your change in savings divided by the change in your disposable income. Once again, the change in disposable income is going to be $1. So in the previous example, we spent 30 cents of that dollar. That means we save 70 cents of that dollar. So my MPS, or marginal propensity to save, is 70 cents. Your addition of MPC and MPS should always equal 1. So make sure you know all those permutations of that. So MPC plus MPS equals 1, MPC equals 1 minus MPS, and MPS equals 1 minus MPC. So make sure you are comfortable with flipping that in all types of ways. But what if there's a change in your autonomous spending? That's an autonomous change in aggregate spending. This is an initial rise or fall in that aggregate spending that causes a series of other changes. So essentially, you could think of it as moving your entire consumption as opposed to changing up how much you spend in that initial extra dollar. So it's a different type of thing because it's going to be a mandatory change in spending throughout the economy. So if there's that type of change, how does that ripple? And that's the multiplier. This is a Keynesian idea. The basic idea of this is it's the ratio of the total change to real GDP caused by an autonomous change in aggregate spending to the size of that autonomous change, which sounds crazy. But the basic thing to think of this, and the easiest way to think of this, is let's say government changes its spending by $100. So that's $100 going out into the economy. And to simplify, let's imagine $100 going to one person. So if we think government spends $100 to person A. Person A then has a choice of what to do with that money. They're going to either spend it or save it. So based on our previous example, that person is going to save $30 or $70 of it and spend 30. They're going to spend $30, and that's eventually going to end up in somebody's pocket. So we're going to say that ends up with person B. So this $100 is our initial change. That's an autonomous change to aggregate spending. So if we track that over here, sorry for my bad handwriting. So we've got $100 that round. Person B now has a choice of what to do with that $30. They're going to save save 70% of that. So, save 70% of 30, and they're going to spend 30% of that on person C. So the spending now increases. Government spent that. Person A spent that. Person B now spends 30% of $30. So person B is going to spend 30% of that $30. So that's going to be $9. That's going to go to person C, who is going to save 70% of that and spend 30% of that. So they're going to spend $2.70, and so on and so on and so on down the line. So all of this spending, you can think, is added to our aggregate spending, added to our GDP, added to our consumption. So there is an easier way to do that than going through each individual. And that's what the multiplier really is. So the multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC, or 1 over MPS. You take that and you multiply it by the autonomous change in GDP. So if we think in terms of the multiplier, my example, so we had an autonomous change of $100. You multiply that by 1 over 1 minus the MPC. So we get 100 times 1 over 0.7. So our total change, if you do that math out, our total change to our GDP is $142, and we'll round it to 86 cents. So if I did this all out, that's eventually what I would get to. But once again, it's easier to do it through the multiplier. So in simple stating, all you have to do is to say, if you have a higher MPC, the less disposable income is saved at each round of expansion. Therefore, the multiplier is higher. So higher MPC, higher multiplier, which means that you need less money changing hands at that beginning round. That autonomous change doesn't have to be as big to fill a gap. So if you are in a recession and your spending dropped by $1 billion, you don't need to spend $1 billion if you're the government. You need to spend considerably less than that, depending on how much your multiplier is. So that's the purpose of the multiplier. We can also use this in the consumption function to sort of represent what's going on. So the consumption function is the relationship between expenditures, consumption in general on the y-axis, and income or disposable income on the on the x-axis. So if you look at this, it's going to be an upward sloping function, which makes sense. As you have an increased income, you're going to have increased consumption. The y-intercept is going to be that autonomous consumption. It's what people need to consume, and this does include government spending. And the slope of that consumption function is going to be your MPC. So if we think about that in sort of our econ terms, it's the relationship between your disposable income and your consumer spending when factoring in all of the stuff that we just discussed. So you have autonomous consumer spending is that y-intercept. That's the necessary spending, and once again, that does include government spending. Your consumption function, if you think of it in terms of like y equals mx plus b format, is consumption equals So consumption in terms of the um, y coordinate equals your autonomous consumer spending plus your MPC multiplied by your income or your disposable income. So that's how you can think of the consumption function. This doesn't show up a whole lot on the AP test in terms of looking at it as the consumption function and being able to interpret it, but it does show up usually on maybe 2 or 3 multiple choice questions. So be able to recognize the consumption function and usually the different aspects of it when it comes down to how to find the MPC from it and how to find the and what the y-intercept means. Now, how do we shift the consumption? Well, you can have changes in your expected future disposable income. If people think that they're going to have an increased disposable income in the future, they will increase consumption now. And changes in aggregate wealth. Now, wealth is not income, and that's something to understand. Your wealth is the value of your assets as well. So if your home value goes up, you feel wealthier and you're more willing to spend money because you have the asset of your house to fall back on. So that's the idea. If assets in general increase in price, in value, then people are going to be willing to spend more. So that will shift consumption up. Also, changes in government spending will shift it up and down as well, because once again, government spending is considered autonomous, sort of in the general ether of GDP. Now to shift gears a little bit and think about investment spending. Investment spending doesn't make up a whole lot of GDP, but it does have a huge impact on the business cycle. It has a huge impact on economic growth as well. So it's very, very important, and it's something that we want to encourage. Investment is shaped by essentially investment demand, which is going to be downward sloping like most demand curves. And if you think of it in terms of amount of investment on the x-axis and your real interest rate on the y-axis, as you have a lower interest rate, you're going to have more investment, more quantity of funds demanded. And that's because you need to borrow money in order to invest it into, remember, this is typically thought of as capital goods. So if you want to build a new factory, you do not have millions and millions of dollars lying around. You need to borrow that. So as real interest rates fall, people will borrow more money for that investment. So that's why it's going to be downward sloping. Now, how do you shift investment spending? This is caused either by an expected future real GDP increased. So if you think the businesses are going to be doing well, you invest more. When you invest more, that actually causes them to do better, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is why business confidence is very, very important, and consumer confidence as well. Same thing with production capacity. If you expect future production capacity to need to increase, you are going to invest more, and that will shift investment demand to the right. So that essentially means the same investment at a higher real interest rate is what you're looking at there. Now, investment demand we will return to later when we take a look at the market for loanable funds. So for now, just a brief introduction to that as sort of a separate component to GDP, something that the government can attempt to stimulate. And that is it for this this basic intro to consumption and investment.